What if the most painful moment of Queen Elizabeth II's final years wasn't caught by cameras, recorded in history books, or whispered in public corridors, but instead spoken quietly, behind palace doors, by someone she never expected? Let that question sit with you for a moment. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because according to a former royal footman, one sentence, just a few words, may have landed harder than decades of political pressure, global crises, or family scandal. And if his account is to be believed, those words didn't just sting in the moment. They lingered. They echoed. They followed the Queen long after the room emptied and the smiles returned. This isn't a story about headlines. It's a story about what happens after the headlines fade. For 70 years, Queen Elizabeth II mastered the art of composure. She survived wars, prime ministers, betrayals, divorces, and the relentless gaze of the world. She learned to nod without reacting, to smile without revealing, to listen without responding. If anyone understood restraint, it was her. So when a man who spent years at her side, someone trained never to speak, finally breaks his silence, people listen. His name is Paul Wybrew. Most people have never heard of him. That's not an accident. Royal footmen are meant to be invisible. They glide through hallways. They serve tea. They open doors. And they absorb secrets like wallpaper absorbs sound. They don't talk. Ever. Wybrew didn't just serve the Queen. He was part of her inner rhythm. He saw her before the crown went on. He saw her when the cameras were gone. He saw the version of Elizabeth Windsor the world was never meant to meet. And now, years after her passing, he claims there was a moment, a private exchange, where something said to the Queen cut deeper than anyone realized at the time. Not shouted, not televised, not officially recorded. Just words. Words allegedly spoken by Meghan Markle. Now pause right here. This is not about proving guilt. This is not about declaring villains. This is about examining a claim, an account, from someone who was there when the doors were closed and the world was shut out. Ask yourself this. Why would a man who protected silence for decades suddenly decide that this memory could no longer stay buried? Why now? That question alone should make you lean in. Because timing matters. And Wybrew didn't speak while the Queen was alive. He waited. He waited until she could no longer be hurt by public debate. Until her legacy was sealed. Until her voice could no longer respond. And that choice says something. Over the years, we've heard endless versions of royal tension. Interviews, documentaries, carefully worded statements, accusations flying in every direction. Everyone claims pain. Everyone claims truth. Everyone claims to be misunderstood. But palace staff rarely enter that battlefield. They watch, they remember, and they keep quiet. Until they don't. According to Wybrew's account, the Queen was deeply affected by a moment that never made it into official narratives. A moment that, to the outside world, seemed insignificant. But inside the palace walls, it reportedly changed something. Not dramatically, not explosively, subtly. And subtle changes are often the most dangerous, because they go unnoticed. Think about it. Have you ever been hurt by something someone said, then forced yourself to act normal afterward? To carry on as if nothing happened? To swallow it, because responding would only make things worse? Now imagine doing that when you were the Queen of England. Elizabeth II was raised to believe that dignity meant silence, that reacting emotionally was weakness, that the crown must always come first, even when the heart aches. So if she was hurt, truly hurt, would anyone ever know? That's where Wybrew's story becomes unsettling. He doesn't describe shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. He describes something quieter, something colder, a moment where the temperature in the room changed. Have you ever felt that? When a sentence lands, and suddenly everything feels different. He claims he saw it happen. And if his account is accurate, the Queen didn't respond with anger. She didn't argue. She didn't correct or defend herself. She withdrew. That alone should make you pause. Because withdrawal was not her style. This story matters now because history has entered a new phase. The Queen is gone. The institution she embodied is evolving. And voices that once felt obligated to protect the myth are starting to reconsider their silence. But here's the real reason this matters. We often talk about power as if it makes people invulnerable, as if titles and crowns somehow block emotional pain, as if queens are immune to words. They're not. Strip away the crown, and what remains is a woman who lost her husband of 73 years, a grandmother watching her family fracture publicly, a leader carrying the weight of a nation while privately navigating disappointment and hurt. If someone she welcomed into her family spoke in a way that felt dismissive, disrespectful, or cutting, would that hurt more precisely because she wasn't supposed to show it? Wybrew's account suggests yes. And that's where the story stops being about Meghan, or even about the monarchy, and starts being about something more universal. The damage words can do when no one is watching. The irony is painful. A queen who endured decades of criticism from the press. A monarch who stood firm through scandals that would have broken others, yet allegedly wounded by a private exchange that never reached the public ear. Why? Because betrayal, when it comes from inside the walls, cuts deeper than any attack from outside. As we move through this story, we're going to peel back layers slowly, carefully. We're going to explore who Paul Wybrew really was to the Queen, why his perspective matters, what palace life actually looks like when the cameras leave. We'll examine the cultural collisions that turn small moments into emotional landmines. We'll question whether intention matters more than impact. And we'll ask a question few people want to confront. Can emotional pain quietly contribute to physical decline? No accusations will be shouted here. No verdicts delivered. Only accounts, observations, human behavior, and silence. Because silence is where this story lives. By the end, you may see Queen Elizabeth II differently, not as a symbol, not as a monarch, but as an aging woman who carried hurt with grace because that's what she was taught to do. And you may also find yourself asking something uncomfortable. If someone as powerful as the Queen could be wounded in silence, how many other moments like this never see the light of day? Because according to Wybrew, what happened next wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was quiet. And that quiet followed her. But to understand why his words carry weight, why this story refuses to disappear, we have to go back. Back to the man who stood closest to her, said the least, and saw more than almost anyone else ever could. Because before the words were spoken, before the silence settled, there was a footman who never expected to tell this story at all. And once you understand who he was to the Queen, you'll understand why his account can't be dismissed so easily. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. Royal footmen are trained to forget what they hear. So why did this one remember everything? That question alone should stop you. Because silence is not just encouraged inside the palace. It's engineered. It's drilled into every movement, every breath, every glance. You don't react. You don't interpret. You don't repeat. You exist to serve, not to witness. And yet, according to those who knew him, Paul Wybrew witnessed more than most, and carried it quietly for years. Before we talk about words that allegedly hurt a queen, we need to understand the man who says he heard them. Paul Wybrew didn't seek attention. He didn't write a tell-all memoir at the height of controversy. He didn't rush to cameras when the royal family dominated headlines. In fact, for decades, he did exactly what palace staff are supposed to do. He disappeared into the background. Imagine a man who knows when the Queen prefers her tea slightly cooler, who can sense her mood by the pace of her footsteps, who understands when not to speak, not because he was told, but because he felt it. That was Wybrew. He wasn't just a footman. He was part of the Queen's personal household, a role that requires not only professionalism, but emotional intelligence so refined it borders on instinct. Ask yourself this. How many people in the world ever saw Queen Elizabeth II without the armor of ceremony? Very few. Wybrew was one of them. He saw her in the early mornings, before the crown became part of the day. He saw her in quiet corridors, not grand halls. He saw the pauses between duties, the moments when she wasn't performing monarchy, but simply being human. And here's the thing most people don't understand. The closer you are to power, the less you speak about it. The palace runs on an unspoken code. Loyalty is silence. Breaking that silence is not just frowned upon. It's considered betrayal. So when someone like Wybrew eventually chooses to speak, even carefully, even indirectly, it raises an uncomfortable question. What could possibly outweigh a lifetime of conditioning? Let's rewind. Wybrew joined royal service at a young age, entering an environment where hierarchy is invisible but absolute. Every step has meaning. Every word carries weight or danger. Mistakes are not shouted about. They are quietly remembered. In this world, the queen was not just an employer. She was the axis around which everything rotated. And Wybrew excelled. He earned trust, not overnight, but over time, through consistency, through restraint, through knowing when to vanish and when to appear. There's a reason he stayed close to the queen for years. People don't realize this, but senior household staff often become emotional anchors. They're not friends. They're not family, but they are constants. They're there when politicians come and go, when family members argue and reconcile, when public storms rage outside. Wybrew was one of those constants, which means he saw patterns. He noticed shifts. He sensed when something was off long before it became visible. And that's crucial, because when Wybrew speaks about a moment that changed the atmosphere, he's not describing drama. He's describing deviation. Have you ever worked somewhere long enough to know when something isn't normal? When the energy changes slightly, but unmistakably. Multiply that intuition by decades. That's what Wybrew brought with him. Now consider the irony. A man trained to observe without absorbing, to hear without reacting, to remember nothing. Yet here he is, years later, remembering something very specific. Why? According to those familiar with his thinking, Wybrew didn't see himself as exposing anyone. He saw himself as protecting something else. The queen's dignity. That may sound contradictory. How can speaking protect dignity? Because silence can sometimes allow the wrong version of events to harden into truth. Wybrew reportedly struggled with that idea, with the notion that the queen's final years were being framed through narratives she never publicly corrected, that her silence was being interpreted as agreement, indifference, or weakness. Those who knew her understood the opposite. Silence was her shield, but shields also hide wounds. Wybrew's loyalty didn't fade when the queen passed away. If anything, it deepened. Without her presence, the stories multiplied, interpretations spread, and moments he remembered clearly were being flattened into simplistic explanations. That bothered him. And here's where the human element comes in. Wybrew was aging too. Time has a way of making memories heavier, especially the ones you never shared. Have you ever carried something for years, telling yourself it wasn't your place to speak, until one day, the weight became unbearable? That's how people close to Wybrew describe his state of mind. He wasn't angry. He wasn't vengeful. He was tired of watching silence do damage. But let's be very clear. Wybrew never presented himself as the star of the story. He didn't sensationalize. He didn't dramatize. His language remained measured, almost restrained to a fault. That's what makes his account unsettling. Because trained silence doesn't crack easily. It fractures under pressure. And the pressure, in this case, came from watching the queen's humanity disappear beneath competing narratives. Wybrew knew something others didn't. He knew how deeply she valued respect. Not public approval. Not praise. Respect. Inside the palace, respect wasn't a buzzword. It was oxygen. It was assumed, not demanded. When it was missing, it was felt instantly. Wybrew saw moments where the queen's posture changed, not physically, but emotionally, where she grew quieter, more inward, less inclined to engage beyond necessity. Were these changes dramatic? No, but they were consistent. And consistency is what trained observers notice. This is where people often misunderstand palace life. They expect explosions, raised voices, tears. That's not how it works. Pain inside the monarchy is absorbed, not expressed, which means those closest to the pain feel it the most. Wybrew wasn't interpreting from afar. He was there, handing documents, opening doors, witnessing the aftereffects. He noticed the queen linger longer in solitude. He noticed her withdrawing slightly from interactions that once energized her. Could this be coincidence? Of course. But Wybrew didn't speak in hypotheticals. He spoke in contrasts, in before and after. Before that moment, the queen engaged differently. After it, something shifted. And that's the detail people struggle to dismiss. Because Wybrew had no incentive to imagine a shift that didn't exist. His career depended on normalcy. Disruption was the enemy. So why would he disrupt the narrative now? Because sometimes, the most loyal thing you can do is clarify, not accuse. Wybrew didn't claim to understand intent. He didn't assign motives. He simply described what he observed. And observation was his profession. As we move forward, remember this. This story doesn't hinge on whether you like or dislike anyone involved. It hinges on whether you believe long-serving witnesses can sense emotional change better than distant commentators. Ask yourself honestly, who would notice subtle pain sooner? A headline writer, or the man pouring tea in silence? Wybrew's account doesn't ask you to judge. It asks you to listen. And listening, ironically, is what the Queen herself did best. As we transition to the next chapter, we're going to step deeper inside her world, beyond public ceremonies, beyond official photographs. We're going to explore what life looked like within the Queen's inner circle, where trust was rare, routine was sacred, and emotional shifts were never accidental. Because once you understand the environment Wybrew lived in, you'll understand why a single sentence, spoken quietly, could reverberate for years. And you'll begin to see how a moment that never made headlines may have left a mark no one outside the palace ever noticed. But before we get there, one question lingers. If Wybrew noticed the change, who else did? Because what happened next suggests he wasn't the only one. And that realization would change how everything unfolded. Few people ever saw the Queen without the crown. Fewer still were allowed to notice when the crown felt heavy. That's the part most people don't understand. From the outside, Queen Elizabeth II appeared immovable, calm, consistent, almost untouched by emotion. Decade after decade, her expression barely changed, even as the world around her spun into chaos. Wars ended, empires fell, families fractured, and still, she stood there, perfectly composed. But inside the palace, the story was different. Not louder, not dramatic, just quieter. And silence, in that world, spoke volumes. To understand why Paul Wybrew's observations matter, you have to understand what it meant to be inside the Queen's inner circle. This wasn't a group defined by blood or celebrity. It was defined by proximity, trust, and repetition. The same faces, the same routines, the same unspoken understanding. Day after day, year after year, the Queen's inner circle wasn't large. That was intentional. She valued stability above all else. New people brought new energy, new expectations, new emotional labor. And by the later years of her reign, emotional labor was something she rationed carefully. So when someone entered that space, really entered it, it meant something. Wybrew understood that. He understood that the Queen's true emotional state was rarely expressed through words. It showed up in patterns, in habits, in tiny deviations from routine. For example, the Queen was famously punctual. If she altered a schedule, even by minutes, staff noticed. If she shortened a conversation that usually ran longer, it was noted. If she lingered in silence instead of speaking, it wasn't dismissed as mood. It was interpreted as meaning. This is how her inner circle operated. They didn't ask, "Is she upset?" They asked, "What changed?" Because something always changed before anything was ever acknowledged. The Queen didn't confide easily. She wasn't emotionally distant, but she was emotionally disciplined. Her generation, her upbringing, and her position demanded it. Complaints were indulgent. Vulnerability was private, very private. So instead of expressing hurt, she absorbed it. And those closest to her felt the absorption. Wybrew was one of the people who learned to read those absorptions, not because he was curious, but because his job required sensitivity without intrusion. Imagine standing just a few feet away from someone every day, hearing their tone shift slightly, seeing their posture stiffen, noticing when their eyes linger longer than usual on nothing at all. That's not gossip. That's awareness. Inside the Queen's inner circle, respect was the currency. It wasn't earned through flattery. It wasn't demanded. It was assumed, and when it was missing, the absence was immediate. This is why staff rarely overstepped. They knew better. They knew that even casual familiarity could be interpreted as disrespect. And disrespect, to the Queen, wasn't personal. It was symbolic. It wasn't about her ego. It was about what she represented. The monarchy, in her eyes, was bigger than her feelings. But that didn't mean her feelings didn't exist. It meant they had nowhere to go. So when someone spoke in a way that allegedly crossed an invisible line, it didn't result in confrontation. It resulted in recalibration. And recalibration is subtle. Wybrew noticed that after certain interactions, the Queen became more measured, more careful, less open, not colder, just more guarded. Think about that for a moment. This was a woman who had spent decades navigating political tensions, family crises, and public scrutiny. She had dealt with open criticism from world leaders and tabloids alike. Yet according to Wybrew's recollection, it wasn't public criticism that affected her most. It was perceived disrespect from within. Why? Because internal wounds challenge identity. External attacks can be dismissed as ignorance. Internal slights force reflection. And reflection, when you're carrying an entire institution, can be exhausting. Inside the inner circle, staff became protective without being instructed to do so. They adjusted. They buffered. They tried to keep things smooth. Not because the Queen asked, but because they sensed she needed space. And here's where things get uncomfortable. Because staff also sensed tension that wasn't being acknowledged publicly. Moments where politeness masked strain. Where smiles didn't quite reach the eyes. Where conversations ended sooner than expected. Again, nothing explosive. Just different. Wybrew later reflected that the Queen had a unique way of processing emotional discomfort. She internalized it, then redirected her energy into duty. More paperwork. More focus on schedules. Less personal engagement. To the outside world, this looked like dedication. Inside the palace, it looked like retreat. And retreat, for someone as socially disciplined as the Queen, was significant. Now ask yourself this. If you were in her position, unable to express hurt, unwilling to escalate conflict, determined to preserve dignity, what would you do? You'd do exactly what she did. You'd say nothing, and that silence would be interpreted as strength. But strength has limits. Wybrew noticed those limits being tested in small ways. Longer pauses before responding. A quiet sigh when alone. Moments where she seemed weighed down by something she refused to articulate. Did he know exactly what she was thinking? No. But he knew her patterns well enough to know when they were disrupted. And that's why his later account doesn't feel sensational. It feels observational. He doesn't dramatize. He contextualizes. He speaks about atmosphere, about tone, about the feeling in the room after certain exchanges. Because in the Queen's inner circle, atmosphere was everything. One wrong note could echo for days. And when that wrong note came from someone new, someone still learning the rules, the echo was even louder. This isn't about blame. It's about mismatch. A clash between modern directness and ancient restraint. Between speaking freely and speaking carefully. And the Queen, raised in a system where words were chosen like chess moves, felt the impact of that clash deeply. Wybrew sensed it. So did others. But no one spoke. Because speaking would have meant acknowledging that the Queen was hurt. And acknowledging that would have forced action. Action she didn't want. Action that might escalate conflict. Action that might fracture an already fragile family dynamic. So everyone did what the palace does best. They carried on. But carrying on doesn't erase impact. It only delays it. As we move into the next chapter, we're going to look at the arrival of Meghan Markle through this very specific lens. Not as a public figure, but as a presence inside this tightly controlled emotional ecosystem. We'll explore why good intentions don't always prevent harm. Why cultural differences can magnify misunderstandings. And why words spoken casually in one world can land heavily in another. Because once you understand the emotional rules of the Queen's inner circle, you'll understand how a single exchange, however unintended, could quietly change everything. And according to Wybrew, that exchange didn't happen in isolation. It happened at a moment when the Queen was already vulnerable. Which makes what came next far more significant than anyone realized at the time. Two worlds collided the moment Meghan Markle stepped into the palace. Hollywood confidence met centuries of tradition, and the impact wasn't subtle. Think about it. One person enters a system where every gesture, every word, every glance is weighed against decades of precedent. And that person comes from a culture that rewards transparency, candor, and direct communication. The result? Friction, misalignment, tension that no one outside the palace could fully understand. From the outset, Wybrew noticed it. He'd seen new staff join before. He'd seen visiting dignitaries. He'd seen family members who arrived full of enthusiasm and left bewildered by the weight of protocol. But Meghan, he later said, brought a presence unlike any he'd encountered. Not because she was loud. Not because she was disrespectful. Not because she intended to disrupt. But because she didn't move in the palace the way the Queen and her inner circle expected. Small things added up. A schedule that was interpreted as a preference for personal convenience. A casual remark that carried more emotional weight than intended. gestures that seem normal in one world, but out of place in another. Wybrew describes a subtle tension growing from these misalignments. Nothing dramatic, no shouting matches, but under the surface, the rhythms of palace life began to change. Staff adjusted. The queen adjusted. Everyone tried to recalibrate, but recalibration takes energy. And energy, Wybrew noticed, was already finite. Because by this time in her life, the queen was balancing so much: state duties, family dynamics, public scrutiny, and personal grief. Every emotional misstep required effort to absorb. Every misaligned interaction was a potential stressor. So when the alleged words were spoken, the environment was already primed. The queen's inner circle was attuned to shifts, to nuances, to the subtlest signs of discomfort. And they saw what happened. Wybrew emphasizes that it wasn't just the words. It was the context, the timing, the unspoken weight behind them. Imagine standing in a room where every gaze, every tone, every tiny inflection matters. And then someone says something that violates invisible rules. How do you react? How do you absorb it? How do you continue functioning while feeling the impact ripple through the room? This is what the queen allegedly faced. Wybrew recalls the immediate reaction. Not anger, not confrontation, just a pause, a shift in atmosphere, a subtle cooling that spoke louder than words ever could. And in the palace, that cooling is noticed instantly. Because silence carries meaning in that environment. Absence carries meaning. Even inaction carries meaning. Wybrew observed this tension building over time. Not in a single incident, but in a series of small, cumulative interactions. Each one might have seemed insignificant on its own, but together, they created a pattern. A pattern that suggested the queen was carrying more than she showed. The emotional strain wasn't public. Cameras didn't capture it. Headlines ignored it. But the people living inside the palace walls felt it every day. Staff whispered in private, adjusted routines, repeated protocols with more care, tried to maintain calm and continuity, even as the energy in the room subtly shifted. It's the kind of tension you feel in your chest without knowing exactly why. The kind of tension that lingers, that colors interactions, that leaves an imprint even after the people involved leave the room. And according to Wybrew, that imprint was noticeable in the queen, not in overt displays of discomfort, not in complaints or arguments, but in quiet withdrawal. In moments where she lingered longer in solitude, in gestures that seemed smaller, gestures that once held authority, now carrying a subtle weight. Imagine the mental calculation required to maintain poise in such a situation. The constant weighing of words, the careful regulation of emotion, the effort to absorb perceived slights without showing them. Wybrew describes watching the queen navigate this delicate balance with remarkable skill. Her mastery of protocol was not just about public appearances, it was a tool for survival. But even mastery has limits. Small wounds, unspoken and unnoticed by the public, can accumulate over time. Emotional fatigue doesn't announce itself. It seeps quietly, and those closest to her, the people in her inner circle, can see it before anyone else. Which is why Wybrew's observations are significant. He noticed patterns. He noticed shifts. And he recognized that the alleged exchange with Meghan was not an isolated incident. It occurred within a context already charged with subtle tension. He later explained that the queen's reactions were consistent with her character, measured, composed, unflinching. But beneath that composure was an emotional current that most people never perceived. This is the paradox of palace life. The queen is surrounded by people, yet some of the most profound impacts come from private, fleeting moments. Moments that may last seconds but linger for years. Wybrew's account forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How do cultural differences amplify miscommunication in high-stakes environments? How do words spoken casually land differently when power, history, and expectation collide? And how does someone who has spent a lifetime mastering restraint navigate moments that challenge that very mastery? Because, according to Wybrew, what happened next in that charged environment left an imprint that would quietly influence the queen's demeanor in the years that followed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't public. It was subtle, and subtle shifts, over time, can be the most profound. As we move into the next chapter, we'll explore the specific words and exchanges that Wybrew says marked a turning point. the moment where silence replaced engagement, and where the Queen's measured response concealed an emotional reaction the palace had rarely witnessed. Because once you understand the context of Meghan's entrance into the palace world, you begin to see how a single sentence, spoken softly, can echo through years of careful composure. And according to Wybrew, that echo was heard by those who served her closest in ways the public could never imagine. Wybrew says he froze the moment he heard them. Because some words, once spoken, cannot be unheard. It wasn't the volume that made them shocking. It wasn't a public confrontation or a clash that drew cameras or headlines. It was the weight behind them, the context, the timing, and the audience. And in that room, there was no one more sensitive to context than Queen Elizabeth II. According to Wybrew, the moment occurred during a private exchange in one of the Queen's smaller reception rooms. The doors were closed. Staff lingered just outside. The Queen was not expecting confrontation, and yet, by the accounts given, she received words that reportedly carried undertones of judgment, dismissal, or challenge. Wybrew described it as a moment of silence before anything happened. Everyone in the room sensed it, though only he and a handful of others were close enough to witness the subtle shifts. Now pause for a moment. Think about what that means. The Queen, who had navigated decades of political scandal, family crisis, and public scrutiny, found herself in a situation that elicited no immediate, visible response. That alone is remarkable. Most people, when insulted or challenged, react instantly, verbally, physically, emotionally. The Queen did not. She paused. She measured. She absorbed. And that's what makes Wybrew's account so compelling. He emphasizes that it wasn't just the words themselves. It was how the Queen processed them. A pause here, a brief adjustment of posture there, a slight tightening of her jaw. For someone trained to observe, these were unmistakable signs. Even the smallest deviation in her rhythm, Wybrew later said, told you everything. According to him, the words were delivered with confidence, perhaps unintentionally sharp, yet lacking overt malice. That, in many ways, is what makes them dangerous. Words that are casual to one person can carry deep significance in another context. Especially in a palace where every phrase, every gesture, every glance is a layer of meaning. Wybrew reported noticing the Queen's immediate reaction. Not anger, not confrontation, not drama, but a subtle cooling in the room, a quiet withdrawal, as if she were mentally recalculating what had just happened. Pause and imagine that. A woman who, for decades, had handled crises that made headlines around the world, suddenly confronted with a moment so delicate it required recalibration. And instead of responding publicly, she internalized it. She adjusted. She moved forward. That is what Wybrew emphasizes repeatedly. The Queen's composure was never in question. What changed was her energy, her presence, her willingness to engage freely in conversation in the moments that followed. Wybrew describes it as a shift from engagement to measured observation. The Queen, he claimed, became quieter, more reflective, and more cautious in subsequent interactions. It's the kind of subtle change that most people would never notice. But inside the palace, with staff trained to read such nuances, it was clear. The room's energy, he says, tilted, and the impact didn't end there. According to Wybrew, this was not a one-time ripple. It set the tone for subsequent days, even weeks. The Queen's interactions with the person involved, and with others indirectly connected, were marked by a degree of restraint that had not been present before. Think about that for a moment. One verbal exchange, spoken quietly behind closed doors, influencing the behavior of the monarch for weeks to come. That's the kind of subtle influence that history rarely records, but those who serve closest can sense immediately. Wybrew's account also notes the psychological nuance. The Queen, trained in decades of diplomatic restraint, processed emotional challenge internally. She didn't outwardly react, but the effect was measurable in posture, tone, and engagement. Staff who had worked with her for years, people who could read her better than anyone, noticed the shift. And here's where it becomes even more fascinating. According to Wybrew, the words themselves were less important than their perceived meaning. That is, the Queen may not have been insulted by the literal content, but by the implication. The subtle challenge to her authority, the unintentional dismissal of her role or tradition, the cultural dissonance that made ordinary phrasing feel threatening. This is the palace at work. Context is everything. And Wybrew emphasizes that the Queen, above all, noticed context. The way words were delivered, the timing, the room's atmosphere, the emotional undertone behind a sentence. Even if the words were innocent, he said, the moment carried weight. Weight that few outside the palace would understand. Weight that, according to him, contributed to an emotional strain that lingered. And yet, in public, the world saw nothing. Photos, official events, and media appearances continued. The Queen smiled. The ceremonies proceeded. The monarchy appeared as unshakable as ever. But Wybrew knew better. He observed what was beneath the surface. Here's a key point. The Queen's reactions were never dramatic because they didn't need to be. Her power came from restraint. Her authority was reinforced by calm. Her dignity was preserved by silence. And yet, within that silence, emotional impact festered. Wybrew also stresses that the incident highlights a broader theme. Even those trained in absolute discretion cannot help but notice emotional disruption. Even the most loyal, most disciplined servants, people like Wybrew, observe, internalize, and, eventually, reflect on what they see. That's why his account is so compelling. He isn't fabricating drama. He isn't exaggerating conflict. He is reporting patterns of behavior, shifts in atmosphere, and subtle emotional responses. And according to him, the alleged words didn't just disappear into the ether. They resonated. They echoed in private spaces. They influenced interactions. They quietly shaped the Queen's engagement in ways that would have gone unnoticed if not for someone trained to see. Imagine the psychological pressure. Every word, every gesture measured, absorbed, interpreted, and one statement, however casual or unintended, can tip the balance in an environment already fraught with protocol, expectation, and unspoken tension. Wybrew notes that this was particularly impactful because it occurred during a period of emotional vulnerability for the Queen. Not publicly visible, but real nonetheless. Moments like these, small as they may appear, accumulated into a pattern of subtle strain. And this is where history meets human psychology. People in positions of immense power are often assumed to be impervious to insult. But as Wybrew points out, emotional intelligence matters more than authority. A monarch may withstand public scandal, but private disrespect, even nuanced, is far more difficult to absorb. So the alleged words, delivered quietly, inside a controlled environment, did more than offend. They altered the room. They altered relationships. They altered the subtle rhythms of palace life. And for Wybrew, who had spent decades observing and understanding those rhythms, the moment was unforgettable. It wasn't public. It wasn't dramatic. But it was consequential. And as we move into the next chapter, we'll explore the aftermath, the silence that followed, the subtle withdrawal, and the quiet emotional recalibration that the Queen undertook in response to that moment. Because according to Wybrew, what happened next would linger far longer than the words themselves, and set the stage for a period of private reflection that no one outside the palace could witness. The moment had passed. The words were spoken. The room emptied. The cameras weren't rolling. And yet, something lingered. Wybrew recalls it vividly. The kind of silence that isn't ordinary quiet, but a presence in itself. It fills a room. It stretches across hallways. It wraps around people without them noticing, and yet everyone feels it. For the Queen, silence was never passive. It was deliberate, measured, and in this case, it was also protective. She did not speak in anger. She did not confront. She did not signal that she was hurt. To the casual observer, nothing had changed. But Wybrew, standing nearby, sensed it immediately. The first thing he noticed was the subtle shift in her energy. She moved differently, spoke more slowly, paused longer in conversation, engaged less freely. These changes weren't dramatic. No one would have noticed them at a glance. But to someone trained to observe nuance, they were unmistakable. This is the palace at work. Micro-expressions, pauses, the way a hand rests on a table, the way a gaze lingers, all of it speaks volumes. And Wybrew saw it. He later described the silence as heavier than words. It wasn't just the absence of speech. It was the weight of unspoken thoughts, the calculation of how to preserve dignity while processing emotional disruption. The Queen was a master at this. She had spent decades navigating political scandals, family crises, and global scrutiny. Publicly, she was always composed. Privately, she processed quietly, intensely, alone. Wybrew noted that after the alleged incident, she began retreating slightly from interactions she had previously approached with openness. Conversations were more measured. Smiles were still present, but more contained. Even the habitual hand gestures she used to emphasize points became subtle, careful. Think about what that means. A single moment, a single verbal exchange, could alter the behavior of a person who had navigated the complexities of a nation, survived wars, and endured decades of public scrutiny. That is power and fragility, intersecting in a quiet, almost imperceptible way. Staff who had worked closely with the Queen noticed too. They didn't discuss it openly, because in the palace, speculation can be dangerous. But they adjusted. They compensated. They tried to preserve the Queen's comfort without acknowledging the source of her shift. Wybrew describes these adjustments in detail, arranging schedules to minimize stressful encounters, redirecting conversations, ensuring that sensitive topics were handled delicately. In essence, the palace staff became emotional buffers. They absorbed stress so the Queen wouldn't have to carry it entirely on her own. And yet, this buffering couldn't erase the effect. The Queen's withdrawal was subtle, but cumulative. Small instances of restraint stacked upon each other, creating a pattern of behavior that reflected internal processing rather than outward conflict. Wybrew emphasizes that the Queen never complained. She did not discuss feelings openly. She did not signal that she had been hurt. That was not her way. Instead, she relied on routine, on protocol, on the stabilizing force of her duties to maintain equilibrium. This is critical, because it illustrates a pattern. The Queen's strength was both her armor and her limitation. She could absorb immense pressure without showing it, but those pressures could influence her quietly, imperceptibly, over time. And in this instance, the alleged words acted like a ripple. The initial shock passed, but the after-effects persisted. Wybrew noted that she engaged with her household differently afterward. Not dramatically, not visibly, but subtly. She spoke with more deliberation. She observed more keenly. She calculated more carefully. The palace itself became quieter in response. Conversations shifted, tones adjusted. Even the timing of movements through hallways and sitting in meetings seemed calibrated to accommodate an unspoken tension. Wybrew later reflected that this was the part that struck him most. The Queen's mastery of restraint allowed the ripple to exist quietly, without fanfare, but it also revealed her humanity. She was, after all, not immune to emotion. Words, even softly spoken, carried weight. And that weight, Wybrew notes, seemed to follow her in the days and weeks that followed. There was no dramatic confrontation, no official acknowledgement, just a series of subtle behavioral shifts, small indicators of a mind processing, a heart absorbing, and a person balancing dignity with private emotional pain. For Wybrew and other staff, the challenge was how to navigate this new atmosphere. They had to continue their duties flawlessly while sensing the undercurrent. They became more attentive, more careful, more tuned in to the Queen's emotional cues. Ask yourself, if someone of immense power can be influenced in such a subtle way, what does that say about the people around them? About the environment? About the weight of words that are never meant to harm, but nonetheless do? Wybrew's recollection paints a picture of a palace alive with unspoken understanding. Everyone sensed the shift. Everyone accommodated it. And everyone knew that even minor missteps could magnify tension. This is why the incident was consequential, even if it was invisible to the outside world. The Queen's withdrawal, measured and silent, is exactly the type of effect Wybrew wanted to highlight. It shows the impact of emotional disruption when it occurs in an environment where expression is tightly controlled and silence is expected. He describes observing the Queen's private reflection, moments when she was alone in her chambers, walking slowly down familiar corridors, handling paperwork with deliberate care. There were no tears. There were no dramatic gestures, just a quiet absorption of a subtle emotional sting. And here's the paradox. The Queen's composure, which the world admired, also concealed the very effects Wybrew wanted to record. Her strength was the camouflage of vulnerability. He also notes that this wasn't a single day's occurrence. The ripple effect persisted. Meetings, receptions, even casual conversations became exercises in careful navigation. The Queen's decisions, her attention, and her energy were influenced in ways that only someone deeply attuned to her patterns could detect. This is the heart of Wybrew's testimony. The effect of words is not always immediate or visible. Sometimes it's cumulative. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it manifests in the subtleties of posture, tone, or engagement. And in the case of the Queen, those subtleties mattered immensely because every behavior is amplified by expectation and history. As we move into the next chapter, we'll explore the concept of respect inside the palace. Why respect was more than a courtesy, it was survival. Why deviations from that respect, even small ones, carried consequences that no one outside the inner circle could see. Because according to Wybrew, the Queen's response was not anger. It was an internal recalibration, an adjustment of boundaries, expectations, and emotional energy that shaped the days that followed. And what came next? It wasn't visible to anyone outside. But inside, the palace's delicate equilibrium began to shift in ways that would have consequences far beyond that single exchange. For Queen Elizabeth II, respect wasn't optional. It wasn't a social nicety or a word to be flung lightly. It was survival. Inside the palace, respect operated like air, invisible yet essential. Without it, the system faltered. Without it, relationships strained. Without it, even someone as composed and disciplined as the Queen could feel destabilized. Wybrew, after decades of service, understood this better than almost anyone. He witnessed respect's quiet power, and equally, he noticed its absence. And according to him, the alleged words spoken during that pivotal moment with Meghan Markle, words that may have seemed harmless outside the palace walls, struck precisely at this invisible, vital currency. Respect in the palace is layered. First, there's deference to position, the crown itself. Next, there's adherence to protocol, the intricate choreography of gestures, words, and actions that signal awareness of hierarchy. Then, there's cultural sensitivity, an understanding that the palace has its own rhythm, one shaped over centuries. And finally, there's emotional intelligence. Knowing how the individual at the center may interpret subtle nuances in tone or phrasing. Break any one of these layers, and you risk offense. Break several, and you risk disruption. Wybrew recalled that in the aftermath of the alleged exchange, the Queen's focus on respect became even more pronounced. Not outwardly dramatic, but internalized. She would double-check phrasing in conversations, measure responses more carefully, and maintain boundaries that previously may have been relaxed. Imagine living in a world where a single misstep could carry consequences not only for yourself, but also for someone whose entire identity and life work rests on dignity and decorum. That is the world of the Queen, and the one Wybrew observed in extraordinary detail. According to Wybrew, even the smallest perceived disrespect carried weight. A glance that lingered too long or too briefly, a tone that didn't match intention, a phrasing that seemed casual but undermined tradition. All of these were interpreted carefully, and in the days after the alleged words, these small deviations seemed amplified. But here's where it becomes deeply human. The Queen was not impervious to emotion. She was trained to mask it, to process it privately, but she still felt it. And respect, or the lack thereof, affected her mood, engagement, and mental energy. Wybrew noted that in the Queen's inner circle, everyone was hyper-aware of these dynamics. Staff adjusted their routines. Couriers delayed entry into rooms until subtle cues indicated it was appropriate. Conversations were redirected to avoid tension. Even the timing of meetings was adapted to preserve harmony. And yet, despite all of this care, the Queen herself carried the emotional burden silently. She did not vocalize hurt. She did not signal displeasure to the public or even to many members of her family. Her mastery of composure was absolute, but the internal cost, according to Wybrew, was real. Ask yourself this. How many of us can truly absorb subtle emotional slights without showing it? How many can continue to function at peak capacity while privately recalibrating responses to perceived disrespect? And how much of that effort goes unseen by the world? This is why Wybrew's testimony matters. Because he had front-row access to the Queen's methods of internalizing these moments. He saw how respect, or the lack of it, shaped behavior, influenced decisions, and altered engagement in ways invisible to outsiders. Wybrew described one particular pattern. After the alleged words were spoken, the Queen became more deliberate in her interactions with the person involved. She maintained formality, emphasized protocol, and limited informal engagement. To the casual observer, this might have appeared as mere politeness. But to Wybrew, it was a clear recalibration, a boundary-setting response to an internal emotional shift. It's worth noting that respect in this environment isn't just about hierarchy or etiquette. It's also about emotional resonance. The Queen valued those who understood her cues, who anticipated her needs, and who interacted with awareness of history, culture, and nuance. A breach, even unintentional, disrupted not only protocol but emotional equilibrium. Wybrew observed that this disruption had ripple effects. Staff who noticed her subtle withdrawal became more attentive. The entire inner circle adjusted, creating a feedback loop of caution and heightened awareness. In essence, one verbal exchange, small as it may have seemed to outsiders, altered the dynamics of daily life inside the palace. And that's the paradox. The Queen's strength, her unwavering composure, masked her vulnerability. She could endure enormous pressure without complaint. She could navigate crises that would overwhelm ordinary people. But respect, or the absence of it, mattered because it intersected with her identity. It wasn't just about ceremony. It was about being recognized, being understood, and being valued for decades of service and sacrifice. Wybrew emphasizes that the Queen's response was entirely consistent with her lifelong approach. She did not retaliate. She did not escalate. She preserved the dignity of her office while privately adjusting her emotional engagement. Imagine that level of discipline. Imagine suppressing visible emotion, yet carrying awareness of subtle interpersonal shifts that may be unnoticed by anyone else. That is what Wybrew observed, and that is what makes his account so revealing. The alleged words, then, weren't just an isolated incident. They were a catalyst, magnifying the Queen's attention to respect and protocol. They reminded her, and those around her, that even in controlled environments, emotional disruption can occur. And they highlighted the delicate balance of personal feelings and public duty that she maintained every day. Wybrew's reflections on this period suggest that respect is not merely a formality in the palace. It's a survival mechanism. And when it is perceived as violated, even subtly, the effects can be profound and long-lasting. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore how this period of subtle strain manifested in the Queen's daily life, how her inner circle adjusted, how emotional currents influenced decisions, interactions, and even the smallest gestures. Because according to Wybrew, the true impact of this incident was not in the words themselves, but in the quiet, enduring aftermath that no public camera could capture. After the alleged incident, the Queen's daily life continued with all the precision and ceremony the world expected, but according to Wybrew, everything had subtly shifted beneath the surface. This is where the story becomes truly fascinating, because public appearances alone cannot reveal private experience. Wybrew observed a new layer of quiet tension in the Queen's routines. Not overt, not dramatic, but noticeable to someone who spent years walking the same halls, observing the same gestures, and anticipating the same rhythms. She continued with state duties, ceremonial obligations, and family events with impeccable composure. Yet beneath that polish, her inner energy had adjusted. One subtle change, Wybrew recalls, was in her engagement during conversations. She had always been attentive, asking pointed questions, maintaining steady eye contact, showing interest in both staff and guests alike. But after the incident, he noticed she measured her responses more carefully, sometimes pausing longer before speaking, and occasionally redirecting the conversation away from topics that might risk tension. These were not dramatic signals. No one outside the palace could perceive them. But for those attuned to the Queen's usual rhythm, the deviations were clear. She was still present, still composed, but she was slightly more guarded, more deliberate, and more inwardly focused. Wybrew describes small adjustments that staff made in response. Meetings were scheduled differently. Certain topics were approached with extra caution. Courtiers became more careful in phrasing, tone, and even timing, ensuring they respected the Queen's emotional bandwidth. Essentially, Everyone became part of a protective echo chamber, buffering her from potential strain. This is the paradox Wybrew emphasizes. The Queen's composure and strength meant that the ripple effects of emotional disruption were largely invisible to outsiders, but profoundly felt by those closest to her. Every gesture mattered. Every inflection mattered. Every sentence mattered. And the alleged words had shifted the balance, subtly, yet persistently. Wybrew recalls moments when the Queen would pause alone in her private chambers, reviewing documents, walking hallways, or sitting quietly with no one watching. These pauses, according to him, were not mere habit. They were private recalibrations, reflections on interactions, and assessments of energy. The alleged incident, though minor in public perception, became part of these reflections. It wasn't isolation in a negative sense. It was self-preservation. It was emotional maintenance. It was a way to process something that could not be openly addressed without compromising dignity, protocol, and the institution itself. Wybrew also observed changes in her family interactions. While she continued to engage publicly, there was a subtle increase in careful listening and measured responses. Family members reported nothing unusual to the public, but those within the palace noticed differences in tone, pacing, and engagement. He describes the Queen's withdrawal as a protective mechanism rather than a punitive one. She was not avoiding people out of anger. She was maintaining equilibrium in a world where every word and gesture carried enormous weight. It's important to note that the Queen was also balancing other pressures at this time: ongoing family dynamics, global scrutiny, and the usual demands of the monarchy. In this context, even subtle stressors became significant. Wybrew emphasizes that the cumulative effect of minor emotional disruptions can influence behavior, energy, and decision-making in meaningful ways. One particularly revealing moment Wybrew recalled involved a private afternoon tea. Normally, the Queen would engage freely, sharing light conversation, sometimes even humor. But on this occasion, he noticed she was quieter, more reflective, responding to questions with brevity, and allowing others to fill the conversational space. To the casual observer, this could have seemed routine, but Wybrew saw the difference clearly. The Queen was absorbing, processing, and maintaining her composure while subtly protecting herself from emotional strain. This period also highlights the often unseen burden on palace staff. Wybrew notes that those closest to the Queen became hyper-aware of her emotional state, adjusting their behavior to maintain calm and prevent further strain. In essence, they became silent buffers, ensuring that minor tensions did not escalate. Wybrew's account makes it clear that the aftermath was not a single moment, but a sustained period of recalibration. The alleged words acted as a catalyst, triggering changes in interactions, energy, and engagement that persisted over weeks and months. And yet, the world outside the palace remained unaware. Photos, interviews, public events, all continued seamlessly. The Queen's composure never faltered publicly. The ripple effects remained invisible, observed only by those trained to notice, those with intimate access, and those with decades of experience in palace life. Ask yourself, how often do we overlook subtle shifts in behavior in people we admire? How often do we mistake composure for invulnerability, ignoring the internal work required to maintain it? Wybrew's account challenges this assumption. As we move into the next chapter, we'll examine the personal toll of carrying silent emotional weight over time. We'll explore how the Queen's private processing, combined with her lifelong discipline, created both resilience and vulnerability. And we'll begin to see how even subtle moments, repeated and internalized, may have contributed to long-term emotional and physical strain. Because according to Wybrew, the real story isn't just in the words. They're in the silence that followed, the adjustments that persisted, and the quiet recalibration that only those closest could perceive. That be why now the Queen had resumed the outward rhythm of her life: official engagements, public appearances, ceremonies, and family gatherings. To the outside world, nothing had changed. To Wybrew and the inner circle, everything had. He describes it as a private toll, an invisible cost carried silently by someone whose very role demanded perfection. The Queen processed the alleged incident not with confrontation, but with internal discipline. Every gesture, every word, every engagement thereafter was filtered through a subtle recalibration. Wybrew recalls the Queen's solitary moments, the spaces where she could breathe without protocol or audience. In these moments, she was not performing duty or expectation. She was processing emotion. She was carrying the weight of dignity while absorbing the subtle sting of perceived disrespect. This internal processing, Wybrew explains, was part of what made her extraordinary, but also profoundly human. It required energy, mental focus, and emotional restraint, all expended quietly, away from public view. The toll manifested in various ways, not in overt displays of distress, but in micro-changes. A slightly slower pace when moving through rooms, an almost imperceptible hesitation before responding in conversation, a brief tightening of her expression when reviewing documents or hearing news. These were subtle indicators that someone with intimate knowledge could detect. Wybrew emphasizes that the Queen was meticulous about maintaining composure publicly. Her strength lay in her ability to internalize and regulate emotional experience. But internalization has limits. Even the strongest individuals carry a cost when consistently absorbing tension without release. Consider the concept of cumulative emotional load. The Queen had spent decades managing crises, wars, political upheaval, family conflicts, and public scrutiny. Each of these required resilience. Each added weight. And now, private moments of perceived disrespect, while subtle, added layers to this load. Wybrew observed that the Queen's energy, though unwavering publicly, showed patterns consistent with quiet fatigue. She maintained her duties impeccably, but her private moments suggested reflection, recalibration, and careful emotional management.